Welcome to our first presentation on the Rule of St. Benedict for novices in the North American Preceptory. I'm Dom Noah Morbake. I'm the preceptor for a 3-year term and also the West Coast Novice Master. And we're going to look at one topic today. Why, as men who wish to live out a chivalrous rule of life, do we study the Rule of St. Benedict? The Rule of St. Benedict is foundational to all of Christendom, but especially to poor knights of Christ. In order to understand that, we're going to have to take a look at the origins of our rule. The Magistral Council for the Poor Knights of Christ in 2009 said this, quote, "There is a spiritual bond and a direct historical link between the Rule of St. Benedict, the Rule of St. Bernard of the Order of the Temple, and the Rule of the Poor Knights of Christ." The Imitation of Christ says that truth, not eloquence, is to be sought in the reading of the Holy Scriptures, and every part must be read in the spirit in which it was written. Even though the Rule of St. Benedict is not Holy Scripture, the same rule should be applied to reading it or any holy work. Our rule of life includes almost word for word sections of the Rule of St. Benedict, especially Chapter 4, the Instruments of Good Work. And in fact, even the hierarchy of our order is largely based upon the ideas of hierarchy within the Rule of St. Benedict and the later Cistercian Reform. In order to understand this deep relationship between the Rule of St. Benedict and our rule, the Rule of the Poor Knights of Christ, we're going to look a little bit at the history of our rule. Our rule was approved on November 18 in 1990. At the time, the Archbishop wrote, "Written in compliance with the spirit and the indications of St. Bernard of Clairvaux for the old order of the Temple, a rule formally approved by the General Chapter of the same order of the Militia Templi." The ancient Templars started with a number of precepts when they were living in the Holy Land that they developed by living a common life. Some people speculate that these were based upon the Rule of St. Augustine for the canons, as that was the rule of life followed by several monastic communities locally. But when Hugh de Pans traveled back to Europe to seek a more formal rule of life and approval from the Universal Church at the Council of Troyes in 1129, he presented all these precepts to the Council Fathers, which included St. Bernard of Clairvaux. Upon hearing each one of the individual precepts, they either approved or voted down, thinking some things were good and some things were bad. So it actually was a monastic rule of life written by committee. However, from the writing style, we definitely know that large sections of it were written directly by St. Bernard of Clairvaux himself. Now, in order to understand St. Bernard of Clairvaux as being the main author of this, we have to know a little bit about the man. St. Bernard was one of the first Cistercian fathers. He was not the founder of the Cistercians, but he was the one who made them really big and really well known throughout all of Europe. And the Cistercians were Benedictine reformers who wanted to live by the strictest interpretation of the Rule of St. Benedict. Now, when we say strictest, what we mean is that they wanted to live by what was written down. Although the Rule of St. Benedict did allow for the abbot to allow certain things or not allow certain things, and when something written down is said that people don't have to observe it, that's called a mitigation. So the Cistercians were fed up at that time with all the Benedictine monasteries, which more or less were just full of various mitigations of the rule. So the Cistercians themselves were extremely ascetic compared to their contemporaries, and also highly anti-materialistic because the monasteries at that time had grown exceptionally wealthy throughout Europe. So we can understand that with St. Bernard wanting to live out in his own spiritual life, and also seeing one of the main evils throughout Christendom as this lax monasticism that was everywhere, why he would draw heavily from the Rule of St. Benedict, which he would have studied, which he would have loved, and probably would have even known by heart. And as such, with a combination of those precepts which the knights developed in the Holy Land by living in common, the Rule of St. Benedict, and the Council Fathers of the Council of Troyes, we see the primitive rule of the Knights Templar come together. Now, the primitive rule of the Knights Templar was much longer and dealt with many more topics. And there are sections in our rule that are different, that are actually taken from different holy documents in the church, like, for example, some of the wording in chapter 5 on the divine office is taken from another document in the church, which will go on at another time. But what is important to realize that especially in chapter 4, the instruments of good works, and some of the other areas, that it is taken directly from the rule of St. Benedict, or in the spirit of the rule of St. Benedict. And so, in order to fully understand our rule, we have to understand that rule of St. Benedict, which it was taken from. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and God bless.